this morning. The format is going to be that I'll set the scene a wee bit and talk about what we've done in the past. Then Joanna is going to take you through the key findings for the 2017-18 data returns. And then it'll be back to me and I'll talk a little bit about what the future holds. So really then, to set the scene, this is the fourth year in which we've received data returns from local authorities that describe the output and the impact of the investment that they make in money advice services. It can be on an in-house or an external basis. This is the first year that we've actually looked at incorporating data in relation to welfare rights advice. And because of that, as Joanna will explain, there's some difficulty in actually looking at data trends, but we can still do that in relation to the money advice indicators that we have. The report is very much a local authority report. We enable and support it, but it's not an improvement service report per se. What we do is we consult local authorities and key stakeholders on a regular basis to make sure that the framework is delivering for them what they need and what they want. We will make changes and adjustments as requested, but very much we do that on a consensual basis, and if we can't get consensus, then we go for a majority. We have an annual overview report which reports on a Scotland-wide basis, but at the same point we also have individual local authority reports that cover the data for each individual local authority. As I've said, very much this is what has been suggested to us as the kind of information that local authorities want and need. And this is the first year that we've actually incorporated welfare rights advice and softer outcomes too. I think we're all aware of the financial position in local government in Scotland today. COSLA recently produced a report which made it clear that in the last 5 years the Scottish Government contribution to local government budgets has reduced in real terms by 4%. Now that's not an across the board reduction. What we have evidence of is that it's the services that are not protected, that are not statutory, that don't have a policy priority that are affected most. Now clearly advice services fall into that category. So we feel it's very important that we're able to give local authorities robust evidence that they can use in any decision-making process about what's effective and what delivers real change and improvement for local communities. What Joanna will go on to talk about is the findings in the report, but what I can say is that, as in previous years, there's no changes here. The reports that we have provide compelling evidence that money and welfare rights advice services are used by those in greatest need. And again, that's been the position for the 4 years in which we've been reporting. We are now starting to measure some of the softer outcomes and benefits of money and welfare advice, and we know that they make significant improvements to the health and well-being of the most vulnerable members of our communities. They don't just offer financial gain to those who are most impoverished. We hope that the overview report and individual reports demonstrate that investment in money and welfare rights advice services offer an excellent return on investment, and Joanna will go on to talk about the kind of ratio that's involved in that. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Joanna now, who'll talk you through the key findings.
Thank you, Karen. So most of you will probably know what the framework captures, but just for a quick overview, the aim of the framework is to capture key performance data for money and welfare rights advice services funded by local authorities. It's intended to achieve a consistent approach to reporting and measuring the performance of these services. And as Karen mentioned previously, this is the fourth iteration of the framework, and it's the first that it's known as the Common Advice Performance Management Framework, due to the inclusion of indicators relating to welfare advice. The draft report is now out with lead officers for each local authority and will be published before Christmas. So moving on to some of the key findings of the data, starting with the services, investment and staff. The total local authority funding in 2017-18 was 25.76 million, This includes 13.93 million for in-house services and 11.83 million for external services. The return suggests that this covers 32 internal services and 85 external services. Looking at the figures on your right-hand side, these represent staffing levels. While all local authorities submitted data for this measure, it should be noted that several highlighted that this was incomplete regarding the number of external paid staff and volunteers. Therefore, the figures presented here are likely to underestimate the number of paid staff and volunteers that work in external money and welfare rights advice services. Moving on to client demographics. These are used to identify which groups are accessing these kind of services and can also be used to monitor trends. As this is the first year in which the framework has recorded welfare rights advice, the demographic data cannot be compared to previous iterations of the framework. So the 2017-18 data returns suggest that 55% of service users are on an income of less than £10,000 a year. This really suggests that the services are targeting those on the lowest incomes. Around 55% are female, and this is consistent with previous years. Just over half, around 51%, reported a disability or a long-term condition, and 25% were in some type of employment. We found the figures on the right-hand side quite interesting. So these relate to the household compositions. The data returns for this year suggest that 45% were single adults, and this compares to around 20% of the general Scottish population. It also suggests that around 14% were single parents, and this compares to only about 5% of the general Scottish population. Looking at volume, the returns suggest that a total of 222,530 contacts were made to money and welfare rights advice services in 2017-18 across the 24 local authorities who submitted data for this measure. Of these, 94,336 were new clients. However, it should be highlighted that 9 of the local authorities reporting on these indicators suggested that the figures were incomplete and therefore not fully accurate. Again, I'm going to go on to talk a bit about the caveats later on in the presentation, but this will have to do with some limitations to the case management systems and internal services switching systems throughout the year. The number of individuals seeking advice as a result of rent arrears rose by 25%, and the returns also suggest that 60% of clients initially contacted money and welfare rights advice services face-to-face, followed by 32% who made contact through telephone, 7% through email, and 1% via the web. I will also highlight that we have a report on channel choice coming out in January, which will be quite interesting. The findings from this will be quite interesting in relation to these kind of findings. So moving on to debt owed and return on investment. There was a 204 million debt owed by clients in 2017-18. This represents a 13 million decrease in comparison to last year, when 29 local authorities reported on the measure. 14 of the 26 local authorities who submitted data for both years saw a decline in the total amount of debt owed by clients. On the other hand, 12 reported that the total debt owed had increased. It's therefore difficult to draw any strong conclusions in terms of trends between the 2 years, particularly considering that 2 fewer local authorities reported on the measure this year. It's also notable that the majority of the decrease is attributed to the 11 million decrease in debt reported under other category. Reported debts in this category include business debt, revenue and customs, national insurance, fines and legal expenses. So this infographic here just summarizes some of the key findings, and this will also be included in the overview report that will be published before Christmas. So I won't spend much time on this, but just wanted to highlight some of the caveats related to the findings. So the returns from this year was impacted significantly by updates to the case management system used by the majority of externally funded citizens advice bureaus. This is Castle, prior to the release of the new version in October 2017. Discussions with Citizens Advice Scotland in relation to this issue have taken place on a regular basis and are ongoing, and it is expected that a full reporting capability will be restored for next year. I will also mention that 3 local authorities were only able to submit relatively sparse data returns due to reporting difficulties. Additionally, 1 local authority could not submit any data in relation to welfare rights advice clients. This is primarily from the limitations of particular case management systems, meaning that services could not appropriately record the data requested. Additionally, media changes to some systems, such as the Council example above, have also disrupted recording. So thanks very much for that. I'm now going to hand back over to Karen.
What we have done is asked local authorities what they use the framework for, because we want to make sure that it's fit for purpose and enables them to actually deliver the objectives that they have for it. The primary reasons, the primary purposes of the framework, and there are others, but these are the key ones, are that local authorities use it for making the case for investment. People find it quite a useful tool to give to elected members in a condensed version to demonstrate the effectiveness of the investment in advice services. It's also used for evaluation, and again, local authorities have told us that they use it often in terms of contracts with third-party services. It enables them to set out the reporting requirements, and they ask funded organisations to deliver in terms of the key categories that are in the data return template. Probably most interestingly, and something that has the greatest impact, is that it's used for benchmarking local authority within individual local authorities, and also in a more general way for identifying good practice that can be shared on a Scotland-wide basis. They're the key purposes of the framework, and we hope that in its current form, with a bit of tweaking, it will enable those to be delivered. As I've said, it's very much a framework that belongs to local authorities. So to make sure that we actually represent what the users want and need, we have regular dialogue, but we also have 2 stakeholder workshops each year at which we consult local authorities on the issues that have been raised as concern or commented on in the course of the year. Now, that's not the only consultation we do. We do try and have regular dialogue, and we have an open door approach. So if anybody has any concerns or issues that they want to raise with us, they're very welcome to do that at any time. And we have, over the past 18 months, attempted to meet most of the local authorities who submit data for the framework, so that we can talk to them about their individual needs. We've held 2 workshops this year in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and the areas that we discussed further are outlined on the slide below. They're ones that we had identified, and at these workshops people also had the opportunity to raise any other matters that they felt that they wanted to have a wider discussion on. The areas that we looked at were the review of operation of welfare, rights indicators and the softer outcomes. As Joanna and I have already said, these were introduced for the first time in this iteration of the framework. We did ask if people wanted to continue with them, and the consensus was that they did. Now, we accept that reporting is done retrospectively, and because these indicators were introduced retrospectively, this has caused some problems in terms of the number of authorities who can report on them. But we have had feedback that for our next iteration for 2018-19, reporting in relation to these will be much improved. The other areas we talked about were inclusion of indicators for homeless advice, and again this was something that we were looking at possibly using the framework to demonstrate the value of public investment in advice services, and on that basis we were asked to consider if it would be appropriate to incorporate homelessness advice. The consensus was that it wouldn't, and that there would be other ways in which we could ensure that the quality of homelessness advice was measured. So that's something that we will look at further in the next few months. What has been suggested though, and what we will look to include, is perhaps some more information about referral pathways between those who are given homeless advice to those who are given welfare rights and money advice. The other areas that we considered were the implications for the child poverty reports. Obviously, we want to make sure that the framework remains fit for purpose and indeed improves, so any suggestions people had for improvements, but also making sure that the framework is in a sustainable model that facilitates ease of reporting. So I'll talk about these in a bit more detail. So the suggestions that came forward were, firstly, that we should limit the indicators and outcomes to those that are the most critical to measure. And I think that's always a challenge, to make sure that you have good quality data that is rigorous, covers a breadth of information, but at the same time it is useful and is proportionate in terms of collection. Having put forward this suggestion, there weren't any more suggestions about, well, what indicators and outcomes could be taken out. So as things stand, we will remain with the same outcomes and indicators. As Joanna has said, there were some issues this year in terms of the external information that was provided by Bureau, because they were changing their case management system. Now, we do have regular meetings with Citizens Advice Scotland. We do try and incorporate wherever possible any suggestions that they might make to us in terms of how best to collect data and how to ensure that it aligns with what's being collected by Bureau. Indeed, the demographic data that we currently collect is based on a series of workshops that were held with all the funders, Scottish Government and SLAB included, and we were the first to actually introduce a common approach to demographic data collection. But going forward, we will again be working with CAS to try and ensure that this is a streamlined approach. One of the big issues that's been highlighted to us is that the current case management systems that local authorities are using are very variable. Some are easier than others in terms of customising what reports are required. We know that Advice Pro is very customisable and that people who use that case management system probably find it easier than others to report. But what we do collect in the framework is data in relation to the case management system that local authorities are using, and we will be doing a separate case study on that and highlighting how perhaps if there was some external investment in case management systems, that might promote better and easier reporting in relation to the framework. The other point which is made frequently is that whilst it's good if the framework takes account of changes and developments, it's hard to cope with these changes retrospectively, and that consistency is quite important. So on that basis, I'll go forward and talk about what are our next steps for the framework. We have taken that message very much on board. So for the next year and hopefully for future years, we're looking at making minimal changes to the data that's collected. Indeed, the only changes that we're going to make are as follows. We are going to add additional categories to the demographic data to reflect child poverty action reports. There was general agreement on that, and there was a feeling that although it might initially be a little more work, it would in the long run be beneficial. So that will be 3 additional categories, which will be young parents under 25, families with 3+ children, and families with children under 1. So we'll be looking at incorporating them. This year we reported financial gain as a total amount, but there was a suggestion that it would be good if we could have financial gain that results from money advice separately from welfare rights advice. So again, that's something that we will include in our data return template and amend it. One of the things that we are looking at is allowing local authorities and, if appropriate, their funded organisations to actually input their own data. So it would mirror very much what's done for the local government benchmarking framework. So we would set up online spreadsheets on SharePoint, and then local authorities could input their own data. We have identified local authorities that are prepared to work with us on this, and we will be contacting them in January and setting up some training sessions and workshops. And finally, and this is a task for us, it was suggested that we should focus a bit more on using the data to identify areas of good practice and produce more regular briefing papers. We have done that to some extent through the paper that's planned for use of softer outcomes, which will be launched shortly, and one that we did previously on engagement with minority ethnic groups. But again, this will be a priority in the next 3 months from January onwards. So that's where we are and what we're planning to do. Thanks very much for listening, and if there's any questions, Joanna and I will do our best to answer them.
Thanks very much for taking time to present today, Cameron and Johanna. Just a reminder for everyone, if you'd like to ask a question, to use the grey chat box on the screen. We've actually had a few questions come in already. So the first one is, what areas of good practice will we focus on?
I think we would like some suggestions to come forward. So if people listening in, or indeed when we go out to wider consultation, there are areas that would be relevant and of interest to local authorities, then we can look at analysing the data in relation to those topics. But ones that we are certainly going to look at are effectively targeting, and I think in relation to the statutory duty because of the Child Poverty Action Reports, that's an area that will be of benefit. And also, as Joanna has mentioned, we have done a report on channel shift, and again we'll be looking at the data to see how that supports channel shift and what the possible implications going forward are for that area. But if people have suggestions, please feel free to put them forward.
Thank you. I've got another question here. Can we include additional information in our local report?
Yes, is the answer to that. There are already a few individual reports where we have included additional information, such as in the caveat section, or additional funding streams, for example. So yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Got another question here. Is it possible to know which authorities are taking part in the online input of data?
We will share that at a later stage, but because we've not followed that up with more detailed discussions with them at this point, I don't think it would be appropriate for us to share now. But there will be information in due course on our website about that. If you're a member of a local authority that want to take part, please do get in touch with Joanna or I.
Thank you. Got another question here. Can you hold the consultation sessions earlier, say in the summer, just after the data has been provided?
We were actually asked this question at one of the workshops too. It's something that we would very much like to do. However, it can take some time for some local authorities, not all I would stress, to submit the data to us. And sometimes it can be late as October before we get all the final data in. Hopefully going forward, because we're making the minimal changes, there won't be the same pressure and need to have earlier discussion, because the data collection methodology should hopefully just roll straight forward. But if people can get the returns in to us by July, we are more than happy to hold the workshops in August, September.
Thank you both. I think that's all the questions we've got for now. So Johanna and Karen will send out a follow-up email with the recording from today and the presentation slides. So thank you very much for presenting. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, just thanks very much for listening in. If you have any comments or questions that come to mind after the webinar, please feel free to get in touch with Joanna or I. But thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.